Let's welcome our next presenter, the last presenter, Zoe Jordan. Zoe Jordan is going to talk about everyday humanitarians, refugee hosting in protracted urban displacement. Zoe is a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Development and Emergency Practices, Oxford's Brookes. She works mainly in urban displacement, protracted displacement, and humanitarian response, where she's particularly interested in non-formal humanitarianism, refugee-led response, and localization. She previously worked as a project manager in humanitarian context responding to urban displacement and continues to work as a consultant, hopefully bringing academia and practice a bit closer together. Welcome, Zoe. The screen is yours.
Hi, thank you very much, and thank you for the nice introductions. As you just said, my name is Zoe Jordan, and I'm a researcher based at the Center for Development and Emergency Practice, which is at Oxford Brookes in the UK. And it's still the morning here in the UK, but I understand that it's starting to get quite late, particularly if you're in Australia. So thank you for sticking with it and joining me today. So today I'm going to be talking about refugee hosting in protracted urban displacement, how this can be understood as a form of everyday humanitarianism, and what this might bring to a wider notion of how we understand humanitarianism. So first of all, I'm going to briefly address what I'm actually talking about when I say refugee hosting, and then I'll move on to think about what do we mean by humanitarianism and how can we bring these two ideas together. So this presentation is based on research that I conducted in Amman, Jordan in 2017, 2018, as part of my PhD work. So as part of that work, I set out to understand what is the act of refugee hosting at the household level. And this was building on my experiences as a practitioner running programs with people displaced into urban contexts in a humanitarian situation, and a realization that while we wanted to engage with hosting practices, there were still many unknowns in understanding what was actually going on and being able to move forward with that. So in my PhD research, I worked with 4 nationalities of refugees living in Amman, so Syrians, but also Iraqis, Somalis, and Sudanese. And I primarily focused on working with the Sudanese refugees. And this is a group about which there's not too much known, and that has changed quite rapidly over the last few years. There's been some really brilliant work done by an organization called Zoe, and there's now been a much wider uptake of one refugee approach. But to give a very brief overview of their situation, there's approximately 6,000 Sudanese refugees in Jordan at the moment, and they've mainly come from Darfur. They've had a long-term presence in the country, but it really picked up in kind of 2011, 2012. And then in late 2015, there was a deportation of a still unknown, but estimated somewhere between 500 and 800 Sudanese nationals, some of whom held documentation from UNHCR, back to Sudan. And then for a few years after this, the numbers remained pretty steady. And then there's been an increase that's been seen again since late 2018. I should also note here that registration has been requested to be stopped. So these numbers are slightly out of date, perhaps. And I chose to focus on the Sudanese refugees and particularly working with Sudanese men, partly because of the realities of this humanitarian context. And particularly, I probably don't need to explain to this audience, but the realities of where our attention and where media attention and funding attention is focused, and what that means for access to programs for other people. So in Jordan, this means that quite a few programs have only been open to Syrian refugees, and refugees of other nationalities have had far fewer options to them. As I said, this has changed in the last few years. It's now looking quite a lot better, but it is still a problem. And then that's been compounded by, particularly for Sudanese refugees, other refugees that are seen as non-Arab and Black, by experiences of racism and fairly outright hostility. And they report this from both individuals and at an institutional level and in a wider community sense. And so that produces multiple exclusions. And then finally, there's some evidence to suggest that hosting, household sharing, is particularly prevalent among Sudanese refugees in Amman. So that's why I focused on working with this group. So this is a quote from a young man that I worked with called Abraham. He's in his early 30s. And when we spoke, he was living, sharing a fairly small flat with his brother and two other unrelated men that he'd met while in Amman. He didn't know them before they arrived in Jordan. And we were speaking about why has he let these people live in his house? And he told me, if someone comes, maybe I can allow him to live at my house. I'll welcome him. Why would I not help him? Of course, I'm going to help him. It doesn't depend on my situation. It just depends on my humanity. I am a human being like him. And this really sums up a lot of the attitudes that I heard about why people would share their home. And I should perhaps say here that Abraham's quite an active volunteer with numerous NGOs in the cities. And I think you can maybe see this a little bit in the language he uses here. So we conducted this interview in English. And I think, this language about depending on humanity is maybe coming a little bit from those experiences, but the sentiment that he's expressing was common. This idea of people are in need, why wouldn't I help them, was very common across all the men that I worked with. So to move on to the idea of what is hosting, I think many of us who have worked in the humanitarian sector will be somewhat familiar with this to a certain extent. It might be mentioned in a situation report. We may have attempted to expand programming to include hosts, particularly if it's cash programming is something I've remarked, or we might just be aware that that is a massive form of support for displaced populations. But as I kind of said in my introduction, there's still a fairly limited knowledge about what those kind of relationships actually entail, how they're formed and how they work. And if you look at the literature that currently exists, which with a few exceptions is largely the grey literature of reports and media reports rather than research, there are three main characterizations that come through. The first of those is that there is an existing connection, often a distant kinship relationship between hosts and displaced populations that they share their home with. Secondly, there's the idea that the displaced person or family is a significant burden for the host family, particularly as time goes on. And the third representation is that refugees who are hosted are at high risk of exploitation, and that's particularly true for women and children. So I'm not challenging those characterizations as such, but I don't think that they represent the full picture. And one of the key findings that came out of my research is that instead of configuring it as a kind of guesthood relationship where one is dependent on the other, or kind of hospitality or family obligation, we need to shift and think a bit more about the interdependency between the parties involved. So in my definition, I understand hosting at the household level to mean refugees who share their accommodation with other refugees. And this is relevant for those who in a non-displacement or non-humanitarian context would not necessarily be living together. And as a starting point, obviously provide shelter, but hosting relationships also often provide food, water, access to sanitation facilities, connections to work. A safe sense of safety and protection came out really strongly and perhaps somewhat surprised me, as well as kind of social and psychosocial well-being. And I think it's also important to recognize that this occurs across various timescales. It's not just a short-term emergency response, and it can last for years. And even if there's one specific relationship between two individuals, two families, that may not last for several years, that format, that mechanism persists. I mean, people might move through different specific situations while still being supported within the kind of hosting framework. And then the final thing I found is that hosting isn't a one-size-fits-all kind of approach. So in my work in Amman with the 4 national groups, which I considered different aspects, including gender, marital status, the presence of children, the length of time they've been in Amman, whether individuals within that relationship have a long-term illness or a disability. What I found is that there are many different types of hosting arrangement, which I've classified those into 8. I don't have time to go into it here, but my point is that it's more diverse than we've recognized. So this is just a very brief quote from Ali, who is a different young man, similarly aged, but living in a different house. And he says we all share all the food together. We share the things that there are. So when food is ready, we don't have to eat me and you, and we know that there's somebody, he kind of pointed to the next room, somebody here going hungry. So this hosting goes beyond the sharing of food, and the idea of sharing is really prevalent. And it's something I'll come back to later, but it's not only a sharing of the financial and material resources they can access, but it's also informed by a shared experience of their lives in displacement. So now to try and keep this brief, but to move on to the question of what is humanitarianism. And I've put this quote here from Ticktin in 2014, who describes humanitarianism as an ethos, a cluster of sentiment, a set of laws, a moral imperative to intervene, and a form of governance. And I've just put this here because I think it gives us an indication about how many scales and forms and objectives there are encapsulated within this one notion of humanitarianism. But perhaps they can all be encapsulated in this idea that human suffering requires a response. But of course, there are many ways of doing this. So I'm going to try and pick up on 5 points that we can perhaps use to characterize the existing international humanitarian response. The first, which you just started to bring up in discussion with Fiona, is the idea of the humanitarian principles, which some would describe as the key to understanding what we currently do. But I do think there are quite a lot of ongoing conversations as to the relevance and practicalities of using these principles in different settings. I think there's plenty of questions now about the political navigation and interest that we see in humanitarian aid. And this interacts with some of the decisions we make about what we do, where, when. So I'm not suggesting we throw these out, but rather that we reflect on how different acts and actors within humanitarianism relate to these principles. The second common feature we might see is the idea of a shared history, a kind of origin in the European tradition of humanitarian assistance. But of course, there are absolutely huge number, a wide range of humanitarian traditions that exist outside of this history. And we can perhaps see alignment and familiarity between some of these systems, particularly if we look at the Syrian response. There's a growing kind of coordination or cooperation between what we might call the traditional Western European and American donors and those of the Gulf states, for example. Thirdly, and personally I find this was initially more challenging for me as someone who's worked in the sector, is the idea of humanitarianism as saving distant strangers. And this as being a geographic distance, but also a social distance, and the separation between the self as the savior and the other as the victim. And I think this builds into the idea of humanitarianism as an emergency, in that humanitarianism is designed to save lives and prevent suffering. It's immediate and it's exceptional. But Calhoun has argued that this makes humanitarianism seem as though it's removed from our lives. And for those of us in Europe, we've been confronting this over the recent years as we've seen greater Syrian displacement into Europe and the presence of camps in Europe again. But also I think with COVID over the last year, many people are reevaluating this idea of distance. And Holzer has spoken about the maintenance of life through emergency. Emergency is not necessarily some brief blip, but it's something that people persist through. And we've seen a growing number of protracted displacement crises and overlapping crises around the world. And then all of this kind of brings us to the conceptualization of refugee vulnerability and the idea of refugees as a victim in need of saving. And I think thankfully we are moving away from this image as a whole in the sector, but it is still prevalent and it's still there. So all of this is just to say that it's not to say that aid workers are not motivated by a genuine altruism or to claim that recipients of the traditional humanitarian assistance don't benefit from the relationship, but just to consider how these things are working together. And while these are often used to define humanitarianism, they're not without their challenges. And I think a focus on the international humanitarian system as how we understand humanitarianism ignores the diverse practices of helping and care that exist globally. And so rather than humanitarianism, building on work by many others cited here, I think we should instead be thinking of humanitarianisms in the plural. And the humanitarian system itself has called for greater engagement with these alternative humanitarianisms, recognizing the need for new actors and new ideas to confront the challenges that we're facing. So we've already heard earlier today about some of the localization agenda, grassroots humanitarianism. We also have ideas about citizen aid, vernacular humanitarianism, informal assistance, refugee-led assistance, just to name a few. So I think this is really a burgeoning kind of area for us to be looking at. And the idea that I use in my work today is everyday humanitarianisms, which is in small-scale humanitarian acts by populations in support of themselves and in support of others in marginalized positions. With all of that in mind, I argue that refugee hosting at the household level is a form of humanitarianism. It meets essential needs, thereby alleviating suffering. It's flexible, it's dynamic, it works in crisis and protracted displacement. It's motivated by the humanitarian principles or ideals of compassion, of solidarity, of the need to intervene and prevent suffering. However, it is very different than the current understanding of humanitarianism as enacted through the international system. And we can kind of see a challenge in the ongoing tension between increasing bureaucratization and distance and the impulse towards greater partnership, proximity, localization, and local leadership. So hosting at the household level instead relies on proximity and a shared recognition of the interdependence between us, or we could bring in here an idea of the ethics of care. And just to back myself up, essentially, this is a quote from 2012, which describes hosting as, in fact, an effort to help, be it for social, family, or even altruistic or nationalistic reasons. So how could it not be considered humanitarian in nature? And other literature on hosting has also described it as the silent NGO in recognition of how much work it does in providing support. So finally, and briefly, I think I'm in my last minute, some of the implications of what this might mean for our practice is, first of all, it can contribute to the ongoing discussions that are prevalent in our sector at the moment and being kind of celebrated through the conference here, in questioning the social, geographic, and power distances between those that help and those who are helped. I think it requires a greater engagement with the biography of those that we work with rather than only the biology. And it's not just a body to be saved. This is a person that needs a situated and contextual understanding of the relationships existing in humanitarian contexts. To do this, as I said, we require an everyday ethics of care, which is the idea that humanitarianism isn't exceptionalism or rescue, but an ongoing commitment. And it's also a shift from caring for people to caring about them and reconceptualizing refugees as both providers and recipients of care. And just very, very briefly, this can help us in protracted displacement. The idea of emergency is not a one-time short event, but something that's repeated. And hosting is one way that refugees engage with this. And they engage in what Feldman calls a politics of living, of surviving, of claiming, and particularly in urban displacement, which, as Stevie said, is one of my primary interests. Through hosting, it's a way that refugees can claim and maintain their presence in urban areas, to claim part of that space. And that opens, again, a further question to some of the alternative forms of durable solutions that are now being discussed. And then with regards to humanitarian programming, as I have suggested earlier, the existing notions of hosting are too narrow and they don't encapsulate the full range of support strategies that are being used. And I think by focusing on these existing understandings, we're limiting ourselves to perhaps primarily thinking about material and financial interventions, rather than seeing these as part of a much richer tapestry of what's happening in these contexts. So sorry, I think I'm now slightly over time, so I'm gonna leave it there, but thank you very much for being here and I look forward to the discussion.